Hey everybody. On October 28th, 2017, I published my first solo commentary video called The Social Media Constitutional Crisis, where I discussed Packingham versus North Carolina, a United States Supreme Court case, and how mass censorship is creating a constitutional crisis. Now, to my knowledge, I was the first person on YouTube to address this in this context, years before anyone else ever thought about mass censorship in constitutional terms. Then, on November 9th, 2017, I published Avoiding Marriage is Not Enough. In it, I showed how even single men are being witch-hunted by feminists. As a result, today, we now have red flag laws. You see, the feminist goal wasn't just the destruction of men, marriage, and the family. As socialists, they wanted to disarm law-abiding citizens in violation of the United States Constitution's Second Amendment. Red flag laws allow them to do just that. In 2018, I challenged Google's adpocalypse narrative because Google provably created the problem and then falsely blamed right-wing content creators. This was reported in Breitbart. Watch the video. It's all there. Then, on May 17th, 2019, in my video, A Case for Reparations, I discuss how American citizens should be suing sanctuary states and cities and all sorts of other governments in federal court for allowing innocent civilians to be victimized by illegal alien criminals caught and released by sanctuary jurisdictions. This is called state-created danger, and in my view, it violates Americans' constitutional rights under the color of sanctuary laws. Then in October of 2018, I published the Social Media Civil Rights Act of 2018. This video was in response to a bunch of pseudo-intellectuals on YouTube calling for regulating social media giants by virtue of making them public utilities. To be clear, declaring big tech public utilities allows them to consolidate their monopoly power. It doesn't stop it. The reality is that the only solution to mass censorship is by legally defining social media platforms as public forums. This is what the United States Supreme Court did in the Packingham case in 2017. Then, in December of 2018, I discussed and presented evidence how major American foundations and the Southern Poverty Law Center were financing terrorists. Given that many of these Antifa and BLM communists have committed crimes, including insurrection against the United States, legally, their funders can be federally charged for aiding and abetting, and their bank accounts can be confiscated as well. Yet, even today, everybody remains silently cucked as these Cadillac communists continue to fund the American insurrection. Then, on December 14, 2018, I showed how Google CEO, Pakistani refugee Sundar Pichai, lied to Congress and asked if he would be criminally prosecuted for lying. Well, of course not. You see, while the Democrats and the Republic cucks bloviate about how bad censorship is, they happily and anally accept big tech's long, hard cash infusions, confirming them as paid prostitutes. Then, a couple days later, in 2018, in my video, Google Values Aren't American Values, I laid out how Google is an anti-American corporation whose goal is to create a culture of socialism and censorship. In reality, big tech censorship is the biggest constitutional challenge of my lifetime. It's a communist assault on both the United States and the Constitution on which it stands. Then in January 2019, I called out Google for what appears to be their fraudulent ad auction business model, something that this most recent congressional hearing finally addressed. That video was called, Is Google's Empire Built on Fraud? You can find all these videos on both my YouTube channel and my BitChute.com channel. The links are in the YouTube channel description and can be found on my website, misandrytoday.com. Then, despite feminists, white nationalists, and envious cucks and cosplay alphas both within the MGTOW and the Manosphere communities collectively trying to dox me for 2 years, I self-doxed myself and sued Google and YouTube in August of 2019 in federal court. In my 500-plus page federal complaint, I called out Google for being a state actor of China and the European Union. I called out Google for its fraudulent ad auctions. And in my motion for a restraining order to bar Google from enforcing hate speech against American citizens, I called out Google for its unconscionable contract that is spread out over 90 websites and at least 3 layers of digital fine print. Today, that lawsuit is in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals because I gotta jump through hoops until the United States Supreme Court gets a chance to look at it. And by the way, I also challenged the constitutionality of Section 230 under the First Amendment. It's my view that it violates the First Amendment's bar on Congress enacting laws that stifle free speech. Also, I served a copy of this lawsuit on the Department of Justice Attorney General Bill Barr. Now, it took me north of 3 times before his office would accept it, but my process server got it done in the fall of 2019, so his office has read it. Now, you might ask, why am I shilling my old videos in my federal lawsuit? Well, it's to demonstrate that long before mainstream YouTube and mainstream media mouth breathers pulled their dicks out of their purses and took their spines off a layaway, myself and maybe a couple others, we were not only discussing these free speech and censorship issues, but we engaged in extensive dialogue to brainstorm reasonable and practical long-term solutions to it. This brings me back to my first video in October 2017, the social media constitutional crisis. Congress should codify the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Packingham versus North Carolina into law. What do I mean by this? It's very simple. First, declare social media platforms as digital public squares, just as the Packingham Court did in 2017. Also, declare their websites as places of public accommodations. Many appellate circuit courts have already done this across the country. This by itself provides the basis for many constitutional protections. Then, repeal the civil rights exemptions to civil liability in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Now, that is unless I win my court case as challenging it as unconstitutional first, which, given the extreme big tech cuckoldry pandemic in Congress, may very well happen. Secondly, create a social media Bill of Rights to apply the same constitutional protections Americans already have in the real world to social media and websites online. Thirdly, while I agree that companies that run social media platforms should be exempt from liability for third-party content on their sites, they should receive no liability exemptions for any censorship and contractual violations they themselves are a party to. Fourth, constitutional violations and contractual violations should be subject to federal civil rights oversight. With this in mind, the Department of Justice should be empowered to investigate civil rights violations for big tech companies based on national origin discrimination against patriotic Americans and Christians, which, by the way, is already codified into law. Sixth, big tech companies that maintain contracts and/or agreements with foreign governments should be barred via the Logan Act from contracting with any municipal, local, state, or federal government agency, period. This is to prevent foreign and communist influence on American institutions such as our local governments, schools, and colleges. Seventh, declare that since the courts have held that hate speech is not a free speech exemption under U.S. law, big tech companies and financial institutes cannot censor or cancel contracts or agreements based on hate speech alone. This is national origin discrimination against American citizens and should be declared a federal civil rights violation. Eighth, create a mechanism for Americans who have lost their jobs or business contracts to not only sue those who tortiously interfere with those business relationships, but they should also be allowed to sue the organizations that participate and promote this sort of discriminatory mob behavior, whether or not they're nonprofits like the bigoted Southern Poverty Law Center or for-profit corporations like Google. You see, some video content creators are more than just news readers or those who create news reaction videos complete with angry and snarky ooh and ah styled comments like knuckle-dragging pseudo-intellectuals. The reality is that any low IQ moron can see the problem, especially since it's been talked about by myself and others for years, while YouTube news readers and mainstream media mouth breathers are just now crawling out from under their jizz-covered cuckold security blankets. And for those sheeple fanboys out there who try to defend these pseudo-Fourth Estate cowards as ignorant, trust me, they knew years ago. They lacked the backbone to actually publicly comment on it. I know, because some of them I've personally talked to, and in private, they were just as terrified to comment as they are publicly, like deer in headlights. You see, talking about these issues today is safe because the establishment is now talking about it. To be clear, these video commentators, they're not edgy, they're not taking the lead, and they're not speaking truth to power. They're speaking on behalf of it, devoid of any independent thought or backbone of their own. And as long as they do, they'll continue to be part of the problem rather than the solution. I'm DDJ, and this is your dose of misandry today.